My name is Osman Sirat, and I'm the Deputy Dean at Regent Business School. I want to thank all the participants this morning for making the time to join us this morning, and a special welcome to Professor Salim Tayob, who will be introduced by our Dean, Dr. Blom. Today, we want to stimulate some conversation into what we are calling uncomfortable truths, the things that DBA research might ignore. And this is in the context of our intention to have the Regent Business School Doctor of Business Administration future focused on problem solving and key relevancy. So participants, before we go to, we are just reminded that you can pose questions to our panelists using the Q&A facility, as well as comments using the chat facility. And we look forward to your interaction. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our Dean, Dr. Blom.
Thank you, Prof. Sidat, and let me add my welcome as well. For those of you who joined us in the first seminar, welcome back. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. And I just, before I forget, want to remind you that our launch is going to be mid-November, and so please watch out for information in that regard. It will be in a similar format as we've had in the last two, and so it would be wonderful if you could join us for the launch. So without further ado, just some housekeeping very briefly. Prof. Sidat did mention that you can talk in the chat, or you can ask questions in the Q&A. In addition to that, please just be reminded to keep your cameras off, just to help the bandwidth and the connectivity issues, as well as your microphones as well. Otherwise, we get serious feedback and disturbance in the background noise. So just a reminder to do that. Okay, so let's get to the business for the day. Today's webinar. Friends, please welcome an old colleague and associate, Professor Salim Akuji, from our time together at Wits University. He is also now an honorary professor from the University of Nottingham. In addition to that, he keeps himself very busy in the current period with being an international consultant in terms of policy, education policy, skills development, and emerging economies. He has published very widely and has presented many conference papers all over the world. However, more importantly for me, he's a thinker, and he's here today because I've asked him to help us think about a unique research agenda for our doctorate in business administration, particularly in the light of being relevant and in contributing to solving real life problems. And that's often not something that a doctorate in business administration are looking at. So, but as I said, I will never be able to do justice to all his achievements. I'm going to stop to try and list all his achievements, except to say that it's grand to have you here, Professor Salim. Very welcome, and thank you very much for making time. So in the context of our current massive experiences in terms of disruptions, he is going to suggest areas beyond the traditional focus areas that we would look at for a DBA, and perhaps help us to take it forward in the future. Thank you very much, Professor Salim.
Thank you, Dr. Blom. It was really nice to make contact again after a period, I think, of about a couple of years. It's really nice to be back in South Africa, quarantine and all, through all the difficulties of COVID, etc. Prof. Sidat, good to have made your acquaintance and colleagues at the Regent School. It is indeed a pleasure to be here to share some thoughts on what I think is quite a refreshing initiative, Dr. Blom. Few business schools as such think seriously about research, and fewer think about what is the kind of research that needs to be done, let alone private ones. And I think I really take my hat off to you and your team. To start with, I know I have 35 minutes and I have a number of slides, and hopefully the 500 slides that I have won't bore you to death. But I think the point I want to make is to try to give you a sense of what my thinking is around BA research as such. And that comes from a perspective of evaluating a number of theses over my time as a researcher. I come to you as a research in vocational education as a starting point, but in education policy making, as Ronel has pointed out, and an advisor to a number of international organizations, NGOs, etc. So I'll be sharing some of my experiences about research to give you a sense of the complexity of a research process, never mind the complexities of business administration research context. So without much ado, let me start, and I need to share my screen. All panelists, right? Do I do that? And it's not doing what I need to do. Okay, only host. I seem to be having a bit of trouble here sharing the screen. Any assistance there?
Okay. Professor Akuji,
yeah.
I have made you a co-host, so shouldn't be.
Okay. All right, let me try again. Oh, not good. So who can share? Only host, right? Okay, fine. Let's see. Is that working?
Not yet.
Technology at the best of times doesn't do
But,
what you need.
I can't believe it. You can share. I'm going to change it to, okay, I've made it. We
All
can start
panelists?
sharing. Okay.
Okay.
I've changed it, see if that works.
Let me go out again, come back in. Okay, let's see. It's not giving me the option of, all right, let me open my, is that coming through now?
No, Akuji.
See? Okay, give me 1 second.
I've made you the host now.
Right.
So you should be able to.
Let's try again.
Perfectly this one.
I'm not getting that panel that says, share particular apps or sections.
Just hover over the bottom part.
Yes.
Just hover over the bottom part, and then you'll see it says share screen.
Yes, I'm doing that.
Okay.
I'm doing that, yes. Only host, all panelists. Okay, let's see. Only host, only host. I'm doing a whole bunch of things here, which says who can share, only host, and then all panelists, only host. So, okay, so let's
change it to all.
Try again. Right, I first said only host.
Yes.
Share screen. Is that no?
It's not coming up.
No, it's not coming up at all. No. Oh.
Let me withdraw your hosting and then reinstate.
Okay.
He's the host. Okay.
You have the presentation?
No.
You can mail it to you.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Okay.
Apologies, everyone. We actually tested this all this morning early, it all worked perfectly. So this is what happens when you have to rely on technology. Perhaps in the interim, you know, if you are,
I could very well talk through, all right,
yes, I
until
think perhaps,
we get it resolved, right? Okay, I think that's fine. Let's run with it, and hopefully people will follow. And as we get the technology sorted out, if that's okay with everyone.
that's good. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, good. So I'm not going to be looking at my Zoom. I'm going to be following my slides in a sense.
Okay.
All right.
Fabulous.
I mean, as I said, a very interesting idea, and I think exciting to be thinking about disruptions in anything. Somewhat disconcerting in a time of COVID-19, I must admit, and everyone feels a bit anxious and uncomfortable when we talk about disruptions. But some are good for certain people anyway. I've titled my presentation Questioning the Questioner. Oh, let me just make sure. Okay, all right. In quest for an inclusively responsive research agenda for the DBA. The intention of this webinar is, as I've identified there, to explore the nature of a research agenda that incorporates the essential role of political economy and of development within it. That's the first one. Secondly, to provide a possible framework by which we could interrogate our research and ask the deep, inclusively relevant questions, and thereby unpack what the seminar calls the uncomfortable truths. And I want to add the incontrovertible truths that need to be unpacked. And thirdly, I want to propose that we develop an inclusive, relevant, responsive DBA research agenda that takes as a starting point the interests of the various actors without relegating the role of current circumstances, the changing and unfolding labor market, and the national development context. Now, that's a whole lot to say in one sentence, so I won't probably write that, but essentially I'm thinking about looking at context, not simply as the first chapter of what I see in many theses as the pastel analysis or the SWOT analysis or whatever else it's called. It's almost as an insert into an MBA or DBA thesis. You know, somebody has said you need to look at team planning or some sort of HR issue, and yes, you need to look at the circumstances. And then pop, the first chapter talks about pastel, and merely forgets about it the rest of the chapter and come at the end and say, okay, fine, we've now developed a really good training program to make our bottom line at least much more feasible and effective. So I started off with three, just get back, and then added 4 parts to this presentation. The first part is to unravel the key features of the current and unfolding or forthcoming labor market. Right, so I'm looking at labor in the current context, what often is in pastel, but expanded. Secondly, I look at the implications of this for a research agenda in general. Thirdly, I sort of almost stand outside of the business school and almost want your input into what are the current dominant practices of what counts as knowledge, what counts as research in an M or DBA context, right? And I know that's a very different animal. So I'm proposing that that animal changes somewhat its stripes, if we're talking about the zebra here. And part 4 is, and I'm beginning to start thinking about a possible framework for understanding this research. And I use the notions of consumptive versus productive, right? And I'll sort of explore that a little bit later. And then look at your call in terms of implications for a DBA research agenda. Okay, let me just check in before we start. Okay, let me continue. And Ronelle, you will just advise me as soon as we get it on. Okay, great. So
Thanks.
Let's start with the first part, which looks at what I see as the current and future economic and labor market context, right? So essentially what I'm trying to explore is what we're up against here, right? And what essentially are we up against? According to Giroux, who talks about public intellectuals against the neoliberal university, he says, across the globe, the forces of casino capitalism are on the march, right? No offense to any particular country or individual ruling anywhere, right? With the return of the Gilded Age and its dream worlds of consumption, privatization, and deregulation, not only are democratic values and social protections at risk, but the civic and formative cultures that make up such values and protections crucial to democratic life are in danger of disappearing altogether. So we're in serious trouble if these forces of what he calls casino capitalism continue to hold sway. So what are we up against? And I want to specifically focus on South Africa, which doesn't mean that this doesn't pertain in the rest of the world. And my experiences elsewhere suggest that in other contexts, they faced with similar challenges. And I want to say that we have a lot going for us out here in this country, but we have to admit that there are some serious challenges. I call them what I used to be calling the pie problem, the unbaked pie of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Now, of recent, and that's a couple of months ago, I've added the 3 C's, which is COVID-19, corruption, and capacity. And I want to add that it's corruption both in the public and private sectors. Capacity development, public and private sectors. So I don't want to sort of name and shame particular sectors here. We have a problem of capacity development, of corruption, and of course, as we know, the health situation. So the 3 C's and PI have key features that we need to really consider. And they are economic exclusion, race and class. I'm talking about race and class. I'm talking about the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter, and its South African manifestations in, a bunch of marketing adverts that have been less than respectful of some of our communities. Gender, now, and we're looking specifically, if we look at business administration, it's about opportunities, the glass ceiling, etc. Issues around gender-based violence, right? Health, COVID, yes, HIV/AIDS is still there, lurking. We have the issue of youth exclusion, inclusion. We have environmental sustainability, SDGs, UN, etc. And we have crime, and I've picked this up from my experiences in the East, the issue of the rule of law. So this is what we're up against in this country. And if you ignore any one of these, and as I say later, if you relegate it to a first chapter and ignore it completely, we're being less than honest, and really we're not telling the whole story. Okay. What's our, now I'm belaboring this point particularly because these are crucial issues. Employment, unemployment. We're sitting with 14 million, as at the second quarter this year, 14 million employed people. Now, we are told, yes, unemployment is not that bad. In fact, unemployment has declined by 4%. Now, I'm not sure many of you know that, but it was 30% a couple of months ago, and now it's 26%. Now, that's quite creative, I must tell you, and exciting. Because the way this is, as many of you know, the way you measure employment and unemployment is that you just take out discouraged workers. So if people are now too sick or tired of applying for a job, they don't apply for the job, they are not unemployed anymore. Strange. I have interesting debates with my economic colleagues about that particular issue, but it's serious stuff. However you cut it, we've only got 14 million people employed, I assume, in the formal sector of 50 million. And that's a huge, huge, huge problem. Right.
Salim, can you see the slide?
Right, let me get into my Zoom then. All right. There we are. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so I think I'm the right slide. Yes,
right.
Okay. Next one.
Go down.
Okay.
Yes, that's the one for the second quarter.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm just going to tell you to go to the next slide then.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, but right. Actually, the next slide is quite an interesting one in terms of making decisions about uncomfortable truths, right? You know, it's that balance between lives and livelihoods that we are all aware of. So I'm not going to belabor that point. Those are the kinds of decisions that need to come through in any understanding of any issue, right? Where do you stand? And we might stand in very different places, putting lives above livelihoods, lives above jobs, etc., etc. But if you don't address the issue for me, you're leaving out a chunk of reality. No matter how real world you want to be, or how problem solving you want to solve in your particular context, wherever you are. The next one, Renal. So essentially, there's the thinking that says COVID affects everybody. And I want to disagree with that, because it affects the poor much more seriously than it does anyone else. I mean, if you just look at Stats SA here, right? Very interestingly, they, in the last labor force survey, they tried to assess the impact of lockdowns and stay at home, etc., etc. And of course, the results were not surprising, right? People that were less qualified tended to not be able to work from home. They were probably in jobs that needed to go out in the battle lines, in the front of fighting this pandemic. And 25%, according to this one graphic here, of those with less than matric were more likely to have a reduced salary. So it is impacting some people more than it does others, right? People, for instance, at managerial level were likely to have continued to receive the salaries that they have, and those lower down the rung were less likely. Okay, the next one, Runa. Right, the National Development Plan has quite an interesting graphic around poverty and inequality and the various challenges that lead to that: corruption, divided communities, etc., etc. Right, I'm not going to go too much into that. The next one, and essentially, Brunel, you can. Yep. Right, I mean, we need to understand this, right? Poverty and inequality, the 5 facts, and Stats SA. So that for me is quite a legitimate and widely held kind of organization that one can quite easily accept. Nearly half of our adult population live in poverty, and we know that the poverty line has been demarcated at different levels. Those in the UBPL, the upper level of the poverty line is 52%. It is based on, it's genderized. People in rural areas are probably poorer than those in the urban areas. COVID-19 has made poverty worse. Inequality rampant of all sorts. Access to income, whether whether you cut it in terms of wages, wealth, consumption, we are one of the highest unequal countries in the world, if one can talk about that. And that is a serious challenge. And again, if we don't deliberately respond to these issues, we're missing a large part of that puzzle. Okay, so now the next one. Okay, the triumph of globalism, market capital, improve living standards for billions. And that's basically one of the key issues that we need as a country to deal with. And it does require us in a meaningful way to rethink that development model. If, as Giraud has pointed out, and people like Piketty have identified, that we have a serious issue internationally around issues of inequity. And they have to be dealt with on the ground. We've done the big work, the macro studies, but we need to understand what's happening on the ground. Okay, next, Ronald. We have that messy tale, what I call the messy tale of two economies, right? A large informal sector, lots of people involved. As you can see there, I've just got 3 graphics. And then you have this 4IR world that some of us live in, right? I don't know where those two meet and how one begins to try to marry the interest of the one to the other. But if one needs to be honest, one needs to engage this particular problem and deal with it almost deliberately, because ignoring it, the problem will not go away. We're talking about livelihoods. And I speak about livelihoods in quite a broad manner in terms of having a job in the formal economy, which of course is becoming less and less easy to do. And of course, just the ability to feed your family and have and be gainfully employed. Okay, so that's for now, the next one. Okay, we still, from Mbeki's time, we've had a number of development plans. President Ramaphosa is still trying to deal with it. And we've just, that formal corporate sector, the formal economy is just not creating the jobs that we need it to. And maybe that's an important issue, but it does seem, and I'm talking selectively here, that business administration seem to merely ignore that in the interest of an efficient organization, or what they call an effective organization. But if you're making your organization more efficient, effective, you're using 4IR and you're laying off 20 people, we've got a serious problem. You need to engage that, right? At least admit that it is an issue, that in the quest for efficiency, we are actually trying, we were actually making decisions about profit above people, if that is the case, of course. But either ways, it needs to be dealt with. When you ignore it at your own peril. The next one, there's an issue with education, yes. Right, this was something I picked up yesterday on the net. 2 years experience, private. Years as BITS graduate, BSc honors, geology, right? There are no jobs. There seems to be a disconnect between education and our skills and the economy. How do you begin to start understanding that? Why is it that we put this lady through 5 years of university, and we're not able to use the skills. And we probably will end up, which is not a bad thing, either in the UK or another part of the world, which is quite sad, and it's a wastage of resources. Yeah, I've spoken about this earlier in terms of that link between education skills, the formal labor market, and livelihoods. Then maybe one issue is to try to unpack how that can be resolved in a way that will ensure that our people at least do not starve, that we move them up the poverty line. Okay. Next one. Right. Guy Standing has spoken about this issue of the precariat, the new precariat, and this was way back in 2011, where he spoke about this new skill called googliness, and I've used it just this morning to try to understand a little bit more about business administration research, and I've got some quite interesting little comments to make about that. But it's about a society consisting mostly of workers in long-term, stable, fixed-hour jobs with established rules of advancement. And what he's arguing a case for is that, say, the old world, 60s, 70s, where you have a job for life, doesn't exist anymore, and we have a new precariat class. So a new take on a Marxist notion of precariousness and the proletariat, in a sense, that we have a new labor market brewing. We need to understand that, take it on board, and try to resolve it somehow. Otherwise, we are all sunk. Right. Now, what does that say about the research agenda? Right. Next. No. Sorry, I'm making you work here.
It's okay.
This is the message, essentially. If you read this and nothing else, you'd have covered the rest of my talk, or the thrust of what I'm trying to say. The idea of a democratic, and I mean that widely, so in a sense, China is as democratic as the Americans are. Idea of a democratic, socially inclusive, economically viable developmental state where business and community thrive. So that link between business and the world needs to be at the start of any thinking about a research question in any DBA, let alone one that is likely to be the case at the Regent Business School. The research requires an economic and social system that is deliberately designed towards establishing a developmental, economically defensible, that's important, economically defensible, not bottom line defensible, economically defensible nationally, and socially inclusive research agenda. Now we say these nice things, but we got to be able to say, how does this impact at corporate level? And I know that if you are a middle manager doing a DBA, not too many people in your corporate environment is interested in this, because I understand issues about sustainability. It is important that the company survives so that you pay taxes and then you have a trickle-down effect. But you have to somehow begin to start engaging these issues if we as a country, or any country, needs to get anywhere. Okay, now. Right, and this is quite an interesting little graphic around who the researcher is, the questioning the questioner, right? Not easy to cut back on electricity. It's about where we positioned, right? Who's asking the questions, right? And I know this is difficult stuff. You almost have to get out of your townhouse development and get into the world of precariousness. I mean, to ask somebody who doesn't have water, how many liters of water do you consume is bizarre in a sense. So it's about, we can't change who we are, but we've got to be able to try to understand what the rest of the world is, and importantly, the majority of South Africans. So it's not something that you're doing for a small minority, which would be necessary in any case. But when most of our people are below the poverty line, most of them don't have jobs, we're going to be able to try to address it a bit more deliberately than we have. Okay, so it's a research agenda for whom, by whom, right? It has to be inclusive. It has to take on board issues around social justice, right? What Salim Valley would call a market fantasy, what Michael Apple would call, consuming the image. There are a large majority of people that simply consume the image because they can't afford to consume anything else. They just don't have the financial and economic means to do so. So we need an alternative vision that places people rather than profits at the forefront of development. So back to the DBA, you need to be start thinking about, okay, yes, the bottom line needs to be intact. How do we begin to start addressing the national issues, and how that this particular entity, whether it's a corporate company, as a small, medium, large enterprise, how do we begin to start ensuring that employment becomes crucial? And yes, there are issues, there's trade unions, a whole bunch of issues, but they need to be resolved. We need to have a new way about thinking about development, whose development, and to what end, and for what purpose. Maybe Amartya Sen. I'm not much of a fan, but I can understand that capabilities are important, and they have somehow been able to address and put on the table crucial issues around livelihoods and development, right? Expand the freedoms, to remove the unfreedoms, and that kind of thing. So economic growth seen as necessary but insufficient means to achieve growth. It's not, everything is not about the economy, lest you think that I'm this Marxist little lefty out there. It's not totally about the economy, but you leave the economy out at your peril. As somebody said, and I forget who, say it's the economy is stupid, right? So I don't want to be regressive and to start, everything, the superstructure, base structure, etc., starts from the economy, but the economy is an important starting point. We have to begin to start thinking about justice, fairness, equity, human rights. And we're good at that in South Africa, and that's one of our strengths, and we can begin to start inserting that. And maybe Regent is where it needs to start. Okay. I mean, some of us who've been in the business long enough understand Castells and the knowledge society, and this is way back late 90s, early 2000s, where he talks about this highly productive, innovative system of production, which needs to be massively corrected, right? This exclusionary process. And at that time, it was, the 4IR just starting to sort of rear its, well, not ugly, but rear its head in a sense, as it began to start excluding more and more people from the mainstream of the economy, right? Not bad, but it needs much more thinking about how to make that economy much more inclusive. Okay. Right. Now, I call this part the science of business administration, right? Because more and more, when people are asked about why they chose this and that particular topic, it's almost like this bubble of business administration, right? This is what research we do. We research the AR, HR, we research about the effectiveness of particular skill development mechanisms, and we look at how important they are for efficiency, etc., etc. I'm saying that's an important area of research, but we need to widen that. Impacts, national development impacts, economic impacts, etc., etc. Yeah, this is my googliness coming to the fore, right? If you do this MBA research thesis thing, you get 38 million hits, right? Fascinating,
Sure.
right? So very, very popular course. I wonder why, eh? Okay, that's something we need to unpack. And if you go into them, I mean, you can go in and find out 50 MBA thesis topics. I didn't go into DBA, they're probably not as popular, but it's close enough. And arguably, research is not a big thing. I mean, there's somebody at the University of Bath, I think, is saying, I didn't apply to any school where I had to do a thesis. You know, on some MBA programs, students don't do an essay to round out their studies. They sink their teeth into practical projects. Now I'm saying, what is this practical project if it has nothing to do with national development? And that's for me, the science of business administration. Let's get real. Let's not worry about this ivory tower. And I'm saying, yes, that ivory tower is probably too expensive in any case. But if you don't engage that ivory tower and start thinking about the deeper questions, you'll get stuck in a quagmire of parochialism, which is as bad, I must say, as not doing anything about the big issues that I spent so much time earlier talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And for me, this is important, and it's insightful to give you a sense of what, if you're studying already, maybe expand the question. And if you haven't, when you do begin to start engaging the question, just think a little bit outside of that science of what I call the science of business administration. And it's possible I got it completely wrong, because there are one or two theses out there that do talk about the issues of gender-based violence, that glass ceiling, and you know, the wider societal impacts of that. Right, so I come from a perspective that says it's not government responsibility to start this campaign of women's rights or any other particular social inclusionary practice. Every entity in civic society has that responsibility, and why not the DBA as the foremost thinker around business administration? Okay, now next. Right. So I'm asking for almost, in some respects, a paradigm shift. Yes, we have to address real world problems, but it's trying to shift a notion of real world. What is your real world? Is it the world of the guy that doesn't have electricity, right? What is your real world? And let's unpack that, right? Yes, no more ivory towers. Yes, organizations do need to function efficiently and effectively. And I'm wondering, with all the research done in business administration, are we still saying that corporates don't know how to do HR well, or team building, or any of the other stuff? There's probably been more research in the corporate world than there has been in government. Okay, I'm going to be shut down for it. But they should have got it right, right? So let's begin to start moving. There's obviously other issues that we need to take on board. For instance, how is it that a debacle like, dare I say, clicks can happen in 2020, right? Is it simply about one individual making that decision, or are there deeper structural organizational issues that we need to deal with as a country? Right? And maybe that needs to be researched. And yes, that's a real world problem, but how many, and I'd be very interested to find out how many MBA or DBA theses really grapple with the issue of race. How many of them really grapple with the issue of collusion? Right, a number of years ago there was this bread scandal. How many of these theses really deal with the issue of listeriosis, for instance? You know, now arguably that's a real world problem, and you ask yourself, why is more research not done on it, so we don't have that problem recurring? And despite H&M, we've had clicks. And I dare say it's not going to be the end of the story. So we need to do a little more thinking, and maybe research is the way. So yes, the key elements, HR marketing is that all important. So what should change? The Now Brigade has come into town. I don't know how we drive them out, but yes, these are now issues that are being resolved, right? What counts as relevant, appropriate, feasible? But, and that's important. Is this what we ought to be doing and how we ought to be doing it? Can it simply be about academic research? What about what counts as relevant, appropriate, and for whom? What kinds of research is being done under the guise of relevance? Is it enough? Okay. For now.
Sorry.
Okay. Right. So what point I'm making here, and I'll go to my last section quite quickly, is there's almost like a sense that we have business interests and they're almost separated from this national interest, right? And as Henry Ford already 100 years ago identified that he was making these cars and nobody could afford them, so he had to increase the salaries of those that worked for him. We're going to have to get on board to understand that your particular company bottom line is crucially dependent on the national development prerogatives. And that requires the uncomfortable and big questions to be asked and answered. So that pestle analysis that you are asked by your supervisor to do is not simply an adjunct to your thesis. For me, I need to understand why you're doing it and how that has been foregrounded as part of the task that you are sort of required to do, in a sense, right? So the 3 C's and the pie need to be very much part at the foreground of your thinking, not at the back. Okay, next. So we need to be reinterrogating the kinds of research we do and have been done for us. Do we need to reconfigure, Ronald, this is for your division, the research, and you're beginning to start engage that already, research in DBA. Need to understand why you're doing it, purpose, means, ends. You must understand what counts as knowledge, epistemology of knowledge, how business administration is understood. What is the notion of business, for and by whom? Whose interest? Is it simply the shareholders? What kinds of research is being undertaken? To what end? I know of a situation not long ago in Hong Kong where business was given massive bailout money, and these were supermarkets, and the large supermarkets took it with 2 hands. And when they were asked why they take it, because they were obviously making a lot of profit during the time, they said, no, well, we've got shareholders to worry about. Is that is important? Yes, but really in a time of COVID where a number of people are struggling, does one really need to know to worry about those shareholders? And that's why I talk about to what end is your research directed. And I'm arguing that yes, it does need to change. I'm now on my last bit where I want to again propose a framework. We need to do things differently, but how? And let me just provide that framework quickly as a starting point to be thinking about what kind of research needs to be done. And I'm using the notion of consumptive versus productive research. Ronel, I know I'm going over time, so I'll be quick.
You're okay.
Consumption, we know about what it means. Consume, to ingest. You simply become a practitioner. You have the certification, whether it's the DBA, MBA, etc. You sort of want to get a particular objective done. Get done with the certification and move along. The notion of buyer, seller, purchasing what Steve Jobs produced versus production. I'll talk about a little bit, where we talk about how, what to create Steve Jobs's, right? The consumptive is research is measurable and efficiency, doing things right, versus the production or productivist research paradigm, which talks about effectiveness. And you probably know about the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness. Efficiency is you do things right. Effectiveness is, are you asking the right questions? Are you doing things right? So you might well be a hijacker, for instance, and you can be greatly efficient at what you're doing. And you can go, I assume, to schools where they teach you to do it much better. But most of us would disagree that that's where you want to be. You want to be effective. And is that the right thing to do? So productivist research looks at producing, to remake, to recreate your outcome rather than simply outputs. Certification is the starting point of a thinking, right? Earlier, I showed you a slide that said that writing and thesis important. It's not the writing and thesis, and yes, those skills are important, but it's the thinking about what you're writing, and that for me is absolutely crucial. And I'm glad that the Council for Higher Education has ensured that the doctoral programs have a thesis component, because it's the kind of thinking that comes through that we need to sort of inculcate. So the notion of not simply buying what Steve Jobs developed, but creating new Steve Jobses as innovation. So productivist talks about innovation to enable what is learned to be used in a new environment, to make new things, to do things differently, etc., etc. What is measurable is always what needs to be. So this thinking that says, if you value it, you measure it, etc., etc. That's something I totally agree with, because there's some things that are particularly valuable and you simply cannot measure. Right. Again, productivist is about doing the right things. The next one to now.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I just lost it for a moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's yeah. Again, my thinking of the last week or so around DBA research. On the top there, I've got responsive, right? On the left, consumptive. On the right, productive, creative, and at the bottom, routine, right? Now, you need to be, as I said, productive, creative. So you need to be in the green zone, right? Yes, a little bit of the routine, because you have to do the kinds of thing that CHE and DHET want us to do. So, and of course, you need to be responsive. I'm not so sure you need to be consumptive at the DBA level, especially because you've gone through that undergraduate, etc., even at honors, but at some point that needs to stop. Right, let me expand that into the next slide. And right, I've used this little circular thing to say, if you can place yourself at different levels here. At this moment in time, I placed all programs, like DBA, MBA, as productive routine. And where we need to get it here is responsive productive, in other words, responsive to national development issues. The real questions, social justice, inclusion, exclusion, etc., etc. That for me is where the real action lies. And yes, you can have the consumptive responsive way, work experiential learning, etc., etc. And maybe some of those theses fall in that particular area. But if we can move that to the top right, I think we're then beginning to start engaging the real issues that I spoke about at the start of my presentation. Okay, so now I think we can quiz through the next one. Okay. Right, researchers. Okay, I think this is just simply. I'm happy for people to sort of review that. So reviewing the current and inserting the new. You have to take on board sciences other than business administration, sociology, political economy, education, etc., etc. So, psychology, I don't have it there, right? And as you take that on board, you begin to start asking new questions and answering it in very different ways. You need to critically review competency and standards of outcome. What outcomes are expected? To what end? The role of, for instance, work integrated learning. I mean, for me, it seems to have business administration or MBAs, etc., seem to stop there and saying, okay, how can we make our organization much more effective? And I'm saying that needs to be moved. You need to critically review the role of economy. We can't take the economy for granted. We need to begin to start saying, how do we move that and have a different development model? And in my head, sociology has a lot to contribute in that particular area. So you insert inclusion as normative objective, and I would be the first one to accept, yes, it is being narrow, right? It is normative. But if I get an argument that says that it's not based on social justice, etc., then I'm prepared to move. But for me, it's one way to move the country in the right direction, right? As I said, notion of development. What is the purpose of the qualification? Crucial question to answer. And this is the question that people that sit on committees where they accept theses, etc., need to be particularly wary about, right? What is the purpose of the qualification? Where is it moving to? Yes, does it respond to our niche area? But does it answer the big questions, right? Whose means are being supported? Whose ends? And do we need to be redefining the mechanisms of effective practice? Okay, now, next. Right, so I'm to the end here. Right, need for understanding the new labor market and what we are up against. I started off by talking about what we are up against. And that's the first question you need to be asking as you do your DBA or MBA. What are we up against? Are we up against not making enough profit? Again, that's not a bad thing. But to what end? Is it for shareholders? Are shareholders perhaps needing to be engaged because there are bigger issues that need to be resolved? Right, it's almost a de-romanticization of our current circumstances, right? Yes, it's a form of casino capitalism, but how do we move it forward? Understanding that much of our current knowledge production practice takes the current economic system as given, right? It's a kickback of the past, right? It happens everywhere, and I would be the first one to say it's a global phenomenon, right? In fact, it's a result of the past, right? The new order needs to be understood, and the nature and kinds of research that we undertake to understand this new order is essential to craft that new order if we want to leave a world to the people that come after us that is better than ours. Next, no, I think it's almost done. Okay, say what change again. I cannot say whether change will get better if we change. What I can say is that they must change if we are to get better. I think that's from a German scientist that I thought was quite useful to just slot in there. And the next one would be the last. Just might require an attitude. Okay. I think we have to stop it. Don't give me a few more minutes because I know I've got a few more slides, but let me just stop there. If you
okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Prof. Salim. That is excellent. I just want to quickly have a look and see here whether there are any burning questions. Okay. So no, there was just a comment that this is helpful and motivating. When can we apply for the DBA? So, thank you very much. I found this fascinating, and I'm so glad that I actually invited you because I know that you're a lefty, and that your view of the economy is maybe more realistic than you know, what a DBA typically looks at. And that's why I felt that it's important to actually have that point of view. And there are lots of things that you said this morning that I'm going to take to heart, and that will actually make a part of the kind of, as we spoke about, the founding document for the DBA. And hopefully students who will come into the DBA will feel that driving passion for actually making a difference. You know, the irony as an old supervisor is that one of the first things I always used to tell my students is that don't try and solve the problems of the world. You know, limit the size of your study. But in this case, I think we have to be ambitious. We have to be realistic, but we have to be ambitious. The time is now, like you say, the time is now. And we're in a position and we're at the point of grasping a new opportunity with both hands and moving forward in terms of possibly what we could do with a new degree of this nature. So I'm going to, in a moment, hand back to Prof. Sidat, but just to say thank you very, very much. This has been fascinating. I don't think this is the last time we're going to have an interaction. In fact, I think we should talk about how we can get you as a regular speaker, not only in this particular field, but once the DBA has kicked off formally, and to introduce your ideas and thoughts and so on to those students as well. And so just finally, I was right in thinking that I need to get a thinker to come and help us think. So thank you very much. Prof. Sidat?
Thank you, Dr. Blom. There are some questions on the Q&A, Dr. Blom, if you want to just
yes.
Have another look at it.
Okay, so there's a question about the period for the DBA.
Yes.
This is Mashudu. Mashudu, the minimum period is 3 years. You know, it can stretch up to 6 years, but the minimum period is 3 years. Then the second comment is there was a very thought-provoking presentation, and there's a question about how can Pan-African knowledge systems be pursued to the DBA. Let me just see if there's anything else. Yeah, so maybe that's an interesting one, Salim. So
yeah, sorry, just
how can,
repeat that, please?
I can repeat it as how can Pan-African knowledge systems be pursued through the DBA?
Yeah, okay. My quick off the cuff. I haven't done nearly enough. I haven't mentioned actually the work done in Africa, simply because I focus very much in South Africa. But I've done some work in Zambia, in South Sudan, etc., a whole bunch of places. You know, it isn't. I mean, the body corpus of knowledge essentially is Western, right? There's some very interesting work that Prof. Letseka, for instance, has done on Ubuntu and that kind of different notions of managerialism. And I can't see any reason why that can't be incorporated into as a theoretical framework for any study. I mean, as I said, I haven't mentioned it, but clearly what will come through is what I call the political dynamics of research, and that is everywhere, right?
Yes.
When I went, for instance, to South Sudan, and I was asked to do a rapid assessment under the auspices of an international organization, everyone told me what a lovely job they were doing, and it was about vocational education, and I had lovely pictures of colleges that were built and you know, were destroyed the moment the big issue was the moment the groups got together, they got themselves armed, and then, you know, went at each other again. You know, so great stories about that, but the UN wanted to give that story, and you had to sort of try to, resolve it in a way that says, yes, this is important stuff, but if you're looking at real issues, what do the people want? They don't need the colleges, because all that happens to colleges is the military gets it as their next base kind of thing. But back to the issue of African Pan-African systems, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and I would want to kind of emphasize that we actually need to increase that body of knowledge, because unfortunately it will not be done by the forces that be from the north.
Yeah, so it's finding African solutions for Africa. So there's another one. Thanks, Prof. I just see there's another one. What about the impact of prevailing corruption on economy and poverty alleviation? I think that is a very insightful question. So the question is about how should we be investigating corruption?
I think not enough is done in the ivory towers around corruption. I mean, that's why part of my problem is that we talk about real world problems, and the real world problem seems to stop at the door of the corporates.
Yes.
And corruption is important, and I would argue that it's rampant, whether it's the scam, or one government minister in some godforsaken part of the country. We need to be writing about it, right?
Yes.
And the less we write about it, the more rampant it becomes, because when we sort of expose it, there's less chance of that repeating itself. And yes, of course, government has to do, and I'm not arguing a case and being sympathetic to President Ramaphosa, but there are issues that need to be engaged at grassroots level,
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, from my experience, it needs to be resolved maybe at DBA level.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. Thank you very much. So I think those are the key questions. Is it okay, Prof, to share the slides with the participants?
I shouldn't say, let me have a look at them again. Right. There might be a couple of names that I would want to take out from there.
Okay. No, what I'll do.
Slides that, that might have
okay, because there has been a request for that, but before I share it with...
I'll just take out one or two slides that might be sensitive.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So I'll wait for you in that regard, and before we share it with everybody else. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Prof.
Thank you, Dr. Blom. Before we go, I just want to, if you'll allow me to, one more question that came from, I think it's Norman Tlamini, that talks to about, he's asking, how do we resolve the now brigade? Because that seems to be described by the supervisors of MBA and DBA. And perhaps it's a larger question relating to the role of the supervisors in terms of some of these things that we're trying to achieve. Salim, your thoughts on that?
I have, but maybe the deputy dean and the dean should begin to grapple with that. I have thoughts. I mean, but
share it with
Mel and
no, share your thoughts. Share your thoughts.
Share your thoughts. Yes.
These are organizational issues, really.
No,
fair enough.
I think the broader question, Salim, is the role of the supervisors.
Yes.
Is that an area that perhaps limits sometimes the type of research that is done? Because supervisors have a template that they want to work against, for example.
Yes. Look, I know that you will have a committee where all research will have to go through.
Yes.
And maybe some capacity development in that regard would not be an altogether bad idea. Where supervisors, of course, would have certain, I mean, I would be clearly one supervisor that would be very clearly focused on what is it that I need. And there would be some students that, and I know it has happened, would, resist whatever I have to say, because it has nothing to do with business administration. So supervisors by their very nature are human. And I think there's also this thing between linking the supervisor with the student. Not all supervisors are for all students. That's
true.
my own experience. So you'd want to sort of manage that in a way that says, okay, let's try to match students with different supervisors and try to of course, where there's capacity lacking, that you'll increase that. But a good supervisor will try to incorporate as many ideological voices and be in conversation with the student, because remember, we in a world where you can't, unfortunately, be so narrow as to exclude other kinds of thinking about particular issues.
Yeah.
So I think the matching, you'll have mechanisms at at faculty level around what kind of questions are useful. I mean, that's the start of a conversation. I think that
Yes.
at Regent, you need to begin to start engaging.
Yeah, fair enough. So it's a question of look up and look out, not look down and look in. So I think that is really useful. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I want to just share. Sorry, Dr. Blum, you.
No, I said you can conclude.
Thank you. So the last chat talks about, from Simba Russia, says wonderful, insightful information, and for that, Prof. Akaji, we want to thank you very much for your sharing your insights with us today, and we want to apologize to all the participants once again for the technical glitches we experienced, but I think we more than made up for it in terms of what followed after that. Thank you once again to our guest and to all our participants. And we look forward to meeting you again on the 19th of November. Please diarize that. That is the date of the official launch of the DBA program. It will be publicized, but please, you can make a note of that, and we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you very much. Thanks again to our guest, and keep safe. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Prof. Thanks, Prof.
Yeah, Prof.
Salim.